Hi everyone, and welcome to this time-lapse tutorial of a fluffy bumblebee. Now I began this piece with the flower. I wanted to work on those background petals first before tackling the bee. And my aim was to lay a solid foundation of colour and tone to make the bumblebee really stand out. So I started by lightly blocking in the petal shapes, focusing on the general form rather than the detail at this stage. Now I didn't press too hard, it was just enough to map out the basic shapes and get a feel for the layout. And I always find that this early stage of planning really important because it just gives me the freedom to make changes without being too committed to the details. So once those shapes were in place, I defined the darker areas within the petals, and I made sure to check the reference image constantly, comparing each petal's shadow and highlight. And I paid attention to the way that the light fell across the flower, particularly in areas where the petals curved or overlapped. Now on a few of the lower petals, especially near the foot of the bee, I did soften the shadows and cooled down the tone a little, just to help with more depth and separation. Now at this point I kept my strokes light and layered, and I built up the colour gradually. I didn't want any harsh transitions between the colours. Instead I preferred a more gradual build up so I could have better control of the final appearance. And to help with this, I used a soft white pencil just to glaze over certain sections and just blend some of those tones together. And occasionally using a brighter white, like the generals, for areas that needed a real lift. And this just helped create a delicate feel to the petals, especially on the outer edges where the light hit it most strongly. Now I took extra care around the bee's legs. It was easy to confuse parts of the flower with the bee's limbs, especially where the little leg at the back crossed in between the petals. So I loosely plotted them in without too much detail, just enough to anchor them in place and avoid losing track of them later. And I made sure to leave room for the darker sections while preserving the integrity of the flower's shape. Now throughout the flower I alternated between cooler and warmer tones, just to deepen the contrast where needed. Anytime I wanted to soften a transition or pull colour back a bit, I just glazed over the top with a lighter shade. And this layering helped me control the brightness and the depth. And on the tips of the petals I just added small dots with my white pencil just to give a bit of texture and break up the flatness, which also added just a bit of visual interest without overcomplicating the area. Now to brighten things up, I introduced some flesh tints in places where the petals caught more light. And by using circular motions and lower pressure, I just gradually brought in those lighter values and started to see the structure take shape. It's surprising how much a few gentle touches can just help define the overall form. Now when drawing the leaves and the stem, I did pay attention to the direction and texture of the leaves, and I just used a shuffle and lift kind of stroke just to suggest that mottled, dappled surface without filling it in too solidly. It's easy to get carried away trying to draw every detail when sometimes suggestion is more than enough. With the addition of just some muted reds and browns, it just added a little bit of warmth in those deeper shadows, and especially when I lightly glazed them. I tried not to overdo it, I just wanted to imply the structure. Now I also added in the trichomes. Now that's these little tiny hairs that sit on the surface of leaves and come out from the stem. And I ensured that I had a sharp pencil for this, and I just gently flicked them out into the background. Now a colour shaper also works really great for these types of details. Now once the flower and the leaves were complete, I turned my attention to the bee. Now I started with the head, and I wanted to define the structure and the edges first. Now because this area included really fine details like the antenna and the facial fur, I kept my pencils quite sharp and my pressure light. I also used some soft greys for the subtle highlights, helping to lift those darker areas without losing too much of the depth. Taking time to get the placement right at this stage really helps the rest of the drawing flow. Next, I worked on the yellow fur. Now, to prevent that common green cast that you can get when yellow sits too close to black, I created a soft transition using a reddish brown first. Now, these colours bridge the tonal gap and warm the area before I add any yellow. I also made sure to keep my pencil clean, as even a little dark pigment on the tip can muddy the bright yellow sections. So I laid down the yellow tones using the strokes to mimic the fluffy texture, and it was important to follow the direction of the fur, especially around the neck and shoulders. So I checked the reference image often. Once the base was in, I layered lighter and brighter yellows and softly blended with a colour shaper. And for extra brightness, I used a light flesh tint just to glaze over those lighter areas. And this helped the fur feel more three-dimensional and kept the colours vibrant. When moving into the darker parts of the body, I used the Cretacolor Black for its rich pigment, and it blended beautifully when pressed into the paper with a Q-tip. I reinforced the deep shadowed areas, especially around the lower body and the leg joints, but I was careful to avoid oversaturating those spaces. Subtle layers make all the difference. I also made sure to observe where the light hit the fur so that I could pull in some of the cooler greys just to lift those areas slightly. Now when I reached the abdomen, I added some warmth and even a bit of orange just to break up the black and keep the texture varied. Fur always has a surprising amount of colour hidden in it, and this little bee was no different. I used directional strokes again here, varying the length slightly, just to reflect the way the fur changed along the body. And this gave the midsection more dimension and stopped it from looking too flat. I then added the leg highlights using some greys and small touches of warm tones, and I left narrow light gaps between overlapping sections, and then later I came in with a brighter white for a few final highlights, and it's these tiny highlights that give the leg joints that glossy, slightly reflective quality that you see in real life. Now at this stage I also added the tiny hairs around the legs and the body, and I switched between light tones depending on the direction and the light source. And when I wanted a really fine mark without too much pigment, I used my colour shaper. And these wispy edges really help make the bee feel soft and natural, especially around the silhouette. Now the final section was the wings, and because the reference photo showed the wings over a slightly darker background, as I was drawing on white, I needed to adjust the tones to reflect what they would look like against my background. So I avoided copying the colours exactly and instead imagined how these transparent wings would look if the background was lighter. And I found it helpful to sort of squint at the reference just to get a sense of where the darkest and lightest areas were without getting too distracted by the colours. Now I started with the outlines using black for the darkest veins and then softened the inner structures with warmer greys and light ochres. And to hint at the blue reflections, I glazed just some small sections, being careful not to overdo it. A little goes a long way with these sort of cooler tones. Now to build the translucent effect, I just layered some soft yellows, some light flesh tints and touches of grey. And then I went over everything with white just to lift the brightness and blend the tones softly. In areas where I wanted just a hint of pink or warmth, I just added the tiniest bit of a more blush tone. And these subtle colour changes just help suggest depth and the layering of the wing structure. Now, throughout the wings, I kept my pressure extremely light and often used my colour shaper or a Q-tip to blend rather than using just the pencils. And it was easy to overwork this part, so I made sure to stop often, just take a stand back and assess the balance of the tones. Sometimes just softening one edge or lifting a little bit of pigment with a kneadable eraser can be enough to create a more realistic look. I finished with those tiny little structural details, those little dots and hairs that pull the piece together. Some were flicked out by using a white or an ivory pencil, others I dabbed on gently, and on the lower sections I adjusted a few shadows and highlights just to make sure that the bee sat naturally within the flower. I also glazed some of the edges just to soften the transitions and prevent any harsh outlines. Now, as always, once the main subject was finished, I went back and softened any of my harsher lines, added tiny pops of colour where I thought they were needed, and refined the edges to help the whole piece come together. I tried not to get caught up in making it perfect, but rather focused on capturing the texture and the light in a way that felt more natural. And that's always my goal, is to find that balance between accuracy and softness. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and a thumbs up. It'll really help me grow my channel. And if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to draw along with me in real time with step-by-step guidance, the full tutorial is available inside my Whiskers to Wildlife Academy, and I'll leave a link for that below this video, so please feel free to check that out. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.